Hello and welcome to part 2 on monasticism. Last time I gave you a kind of a history of the origins of how monasticism got started, some of the terms, what they mean, and so forth. And I was telling you that a lot of people, especially from the kinds of churches that I have associated with in my Christian life of 43 years, have kind of viewed monasticism as an erroneous sort of movement, something too legalistic or too extreme or something like that. And I hope that I have tried to show you that I don't think that's really an accurate portrayal at all. I think, in fact, there is much that is of God in the monastic movement, and there's a lot of it, a lot that we today need to consider and study, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from the monastic movement and the monks throughout the centuries of church history. I kind of wrapped up last time by saying that I want to show you this and kind of prove this thesis that monasticism is a positive development by just kind of mentioning various famous monks or monastic type people who live this ascetic kind of life. And so we started off, I talked about Anthony of Egypt, one of the first monks we know of, and how he was written about by Athanasius. Then we talked about the Cappadocian fathers, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, and Basil of Caesarea, their great input into church history and the teaching of the church on the Trinity particularly. I mentioned to you John Cassian, who was a man who learned monasticism in Egypt and Syria, and then was kind of largely responsible for transmitting that into Western Europe, because he took it to France and developed monasteries there. We looked at the amazing man, St. Jerome, a tremendous monk and ascetic man, but a scholar as well, the man who is largely responsible for translating the Greek manuscripts and Hebrew manuscripts into the Latin version of the Bible known as the Vulgate that was used for 1,000 years in Europe. And then we ended up talking about Augustine of Hippo. There's more than one Augustine, so you have to mention that he's of Hippo because he's the bishop of a town called Hippo in North Africa, near the more well-known city of Carthage. And we talked about that and how what an impact Augustine has had upon church history. We still have over 5 million of his written words. And so he was an ascetic, a monastic, a man who propagated the ascetic lifestyle, and a man who taught theology and greatly enriched us all. The next one I want to touch on is one that's often misunderstood today, or I should say people have a lot of wrong ideas about this next monk I want to mention, and that is Patrick, St. Patrick. Of course, nowadays you have St. Patrick's Day, St. Patty's Day. People dress in green, they drink green beer. They think that he's a Catholic saint and that he's an Irishman. And actually, neither of those is true. He was not Roman Catholic, because in the years that he was at work, the Roman Catholic Church per se didn't exist. And he's actually not Irish, he's a Briton. Patrick was born in what is the UK today, Britain today, and he lived on the coast. And because of that, at a certain point in his young life, he was taken captive by pirates who were raiding the coastland there. So they took Patrick to Ireland as a slave, and that's how he first came to that land. And they put him in the fields tending swine. So he had to feed and tend the swine. And he was there for some 6 years as a slave. But then Patrick was able to make his way out. He was able to escape and get to the coast and get back to Britain. He eventually had a Christian conversion. He ended up in a monastery. He was trained in the way of the monastics. But then, as he grew in his walk with the Lord and so forth, he had a dream. It's said, there's some legendary qualities to some of the story, but it appears that he had a sort of a dream or a vision in which he perceived that the people of Ireland were saying, "Oh, holy boy, come and walk among us again." And so Patrick took that as a call from God. He ended up going back to Ireland around the year 453 AD, and his work there is legendary. And of course, legendary is not always good because sometimes it's embellished and so forth, and it's kind of hard to tell truth from fiction. But we know that he had a profound effect upon that land and planted many churches and monasteries and raised up many monks and many servants of the Lord. And the Irish church then went on to have a tremendous impact throughout Europe and even beyond. The Celtic church, as it's known, became a powerful influence throughout Western Europe. So St. Patrick was quite a man of God, and someone worthy of our study and respect. The next monk I want to mention is Benedict of Nursia. This is an area of Italy, and this man died around the year 547. He learned monasticism from John Cassian, who I mentioned earlier, who brought the ways of monasticism from Egypt to Europe. But Benedict went on to develop quite a few monasteries himself in Italy. And the most famous one was called Monte Cassino. That was one of the greatest monasteries ever established in northern Italy. And so Benedict established that. He also wrote a rule for monks, which became known as the Benedictine rule, with, among other things, the motto, pray and work. So he taught monks how to live. And his monastic rule became really widespread and widely accepted because it was balanced, and it taught monks a lot of very useful wisdom that they could apply and live by, and it enabled a monastic life to flourish and spread. And his monks were not to be idle. He taught them to pray and work, and to always occupy themselves with something useful. See, in the classical cultures of Greece and Rome, higher class people disdained work. If you were of the upper classes, you thought, oh, manual labor, that's beneath me. So it was quite important that the Benedictine monks did not disdain work, but instead saw it as something that was a good thing, that we were meant to be occupied and meant to be busy with. And it was good because that way we could take care of our own needs, meet our needs in farming and so forth. And we would also be diligent and disciplined, and it's just good for you spiritually. And so that really elevated the concept of work of all kinds, especially including physical work. And that had a profound impact upon Europe and still has an impact upon America today. The Benedictines took vows of poverty, so they were to have no physical possessions. They also took a vow of obedience and chastity. They pioneered new agricultural methods, new plows, a system of 3 fields where you alternated planting and harvesting and so forth. That had quite an impact upon agriculture and productivity and made it possible for Europe to flourish. They also cultivated fine crafts, different kinds of craftsmanship, and they excelled in artistic hand copying and illuminating books and Bibles. Remember, there was no printing press at this time, so every Bible, every book had to be hand copied, and these monks would diligently illuminate these books. And perhaps you've seen some of these Bibles. You can see them at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., for example, or at the Holy Land Experience in Orlando, Florida. But it's beautiful. I have lots of pictures of them, and they would very meticulously make the large capital letters at the beginning of each chapter and so forth, and did that all by hand. Very beautiful work. They also copied the writings of the ancient church fathers and the classical literature of Greece and Rome. They helped to preserve that and disseminate it. Many monastic groups did, and that's how the literature and so forth of Greece and Rome was preserved. If it wasn't for the monks, we would have lost all of those things forever. But they copied it diligently and disseminated it. And they became missionaries, the Benedictines did, to Western Europe and Britain. Benedict was the guy who developed the idea of dividing the monks' day into time for work, study, of scripture, meditation, common meals, and regular hours for prayer and singing. He had 7 divine offices or services that he developed. And in 1980, Pope John Paul II declared Benedict the patron saint of Europe, along with Cyril and Methodius, who I'm also going to mention in a bit. So Benedict had quite an impact, and he's an important man to know about, Benedict of Nursia. The next man I want to mention is Columba. He was an Irishman who started the monastery on the island of Iona off the coast of Scotland in 563 AD. I was blessed in 2017. My daughter paid for me to come over to UK and travel with her and her family. And she said, "Where do you want to go, Dad?" And one of the main places I wanted to see was the island of Iona. She said, "I never heard of it. What is it?" She had to find it. We located it. We figured out how to get there. And we went one day. And you know what? It turned out to be a sunny, beautiful day. And I have pictures of the place. I was so impressed because all the books I read about it said it was a storm-racked island off the coast of Scotland where it was always dark and cloudy and foggy. And the day we got there, it looked like, we were in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands or something. The water was crystal clear. It was just beautiful and sunny. We had a wonderful time there. But Columba, he started that monastery there. He sailed with 12 men. They used to travel in groups of 12 following Jesus' pattern. And he established his monastery there. And at first he lived for years in a hut. But on that place, it became a monastery and a church, and then a center for evangelization and missions and so forth. And Columba is credited with reaching various groups of Scotland and spreading the gospel. He reached the Picts, for example, but various other groups, and started several churches in what's called the Hebrides. And he also started other monasteries. He wrote poems. And he's credited with translating or transcribing some 300 different Christian works so that the people that he was evangelizing could have the writings of other Christians from earlier times. So tremendous worker, a very diligent man. He translated into the languages of his target peoples. And so Iona became a very important mission center that would have an impact on many other areas. And missionaries went from Iona to Britain, to Scotland, Ireland, and into parts of Europe. And so, very, very important. Other Celtic monks traveled throughout what's today France. It was called Gaul then, and other areas. And they too preserved and spread classical literature and culture all around, and saved that for us. The next man I want to mention has a name very similar, so you have to be careful you don't confuse the two. The one I just talked about that started the monastery in Iona was Columba, but then there's another man named Columban with an N at the end, and sometimes you'll see his name Columbanus, which is the more Latinized version. This man was Irish. Columba was Irish, and Columban was Irish, but he was a great big man, a big, powerful man. And he was born the year that Saint Benedict died, actually. And Columban was a man who went from Ireland and took the gospel to Gaul in 575. And he spread the gospel all over France, interacted with kings there, got them to accept Christ. He was a powerful witness. He got into trouble because he was so strong and direct, and he was kicked out, actually. But God did miraculous things through him. The guy eventually established some 40 monasteries, which then served as mission centers throughout Europe. And he is largely responsible for reaching the Saxon people, who then carried the gospel on further to Scandinavia. So Columban is an important monk. Next, I want to mention Pope Gregory the First, or Gregory the Great. He served as Pope from 590 to 604. He was a monk. He was an ascetic. And a great man of God, a great administrator as well, a powerful organizer of the church, a man who helped the Catholic Church to be strengthened and so forth. And one of the main things that Gregory is known for, besides Gregorian chants, you've surely heard of Gregorian chants, the beautiful music which he taught. He taught worship. He taught people to sing these chants, his monks and so forth. And but he's also most famous perhaps for kind of being responsible for the evangelization of England, because Gregory is supposedly, the story goes, he was in a market area of Rome one day and saw some young blonde-haired, blue-eyed boys being sold as slaves. And he questioned one of his attendants, who are these? What are these boys? And where are they from? And he was told they're Angles. You know, those of us who are English were called Anglo-Saxon, right? So Anglos are the people from England, and Angles. And so Gregory said, oh, they're called Angles, are they? Well, they should be angels. They should become angels. And so he said, we've got to evangelize these folks wherever they're from. I want to make sure that we establish the church there. So who could he send? Well, he could send monks, because you see regular folks are tied down. They have their jobs, their families, and so forth. They can't go. Who could do the work of the gospel? Monks. They're more closely, their lifestyle is closer to the lifestyle of Jesus and the apostles, because they're dedicated fully to the Lord and they're ready to go. By the way, that's one of the reasons I'm so interested in monasticism. I used to be in various mission organizations. I've been in 4. And the one I was in the longest was called Youth of the Mission. And in many ways, Youth with a Mission was very much like a monastic sort of group, except we weren't celibate. We didn't take vows of poverty. But we lived together, and we were fully committed to serving the Lord. And so you could do more with a group like that than you can with regular folks. And so that's the way it was. Pope Gregory, when he wanted to evangelize England, he searched around. Who could he find? Who could he send? He found a monk by the name of Augustine. Now, this is not Augustine of Hippo. This is a different Augustine. He's later referred to as Augustine of Canterbury. Why? Because he was sent to England, and he went there and established a mission center in Canterbury, which later became like the center of the church world of England, the Anglican Church and so forth. He went there in 597 to plant the Catholic Church. It's interesting because he and his crew of other monks who were sent out, they traveled through Gaul on their way there. And actually, at one point, they became so discouraged, they turned back, and he wrote to the Pope and said, can we please come home? This is too hard. And so that's an encouragement to us to realize that all the saints of God have encountered difficult times and sometimes want to give up, and sometimes you need somebody over you to kind of say, no, man, get back out there and keep on going. God's with you. He's going to help you. So the Pope said, get back out there. Get over there. Do your job. And Augustine of Canterbury ended up getting over to England. He established a monastery there, and he evangelized the English. He was largely responsible for bringing the Catholic Church to England. By the way, it was during this time when Pope Gregory was in power, and he was a great pope and a great administrator. It was during this time that the Roman Empire again had only one empire. Remember, under Diocletian they split and they had 4 at one time and so on. At this time they only had one, and he was in Constantinople. And the Roman Empire was having lots of difficulties with the Persian Empire farther east. And so it was during the time of Gregory that the Pope rose in greater prominence and authority and so forth, because the emperor wasn't around. And I'm just saying that as an aside. The next monk I want to mention was Aidan, or Aidan. This is the mid-7th century. His name, Aidan, means little fiery one. I like the sound of that. I'd like to meet this guy. And so Aidan was an Irish monk who was a monk in Iona, off the coast of Scotland that I just talked about a minute ago. He served there for some time. Well, on the island of Iona at that time, there was a man named Oswald. Oswald happened to be the rightful king of a place called Northumbria in England. But there was a lot of turmoil and disruption and so forth, and he had fled from his homeland and had come to Iona in exile. So he was a king in exile, and he learned the ways of Christ and the ways of monasticism there on the island of Iona. Well, things changed in his homeland. He returned and was able to fight some battles and gain the upper hand and became the king of Northumbria. One of the first things Oswald did was he sent messengers to Iona. He said, please, send missionaries up here. I want my people to be Christian. So they sent a guy up there, the first monk that they sent, and he went up and he didn't do well. He fell on his face. He offended the people. He said they were too stupid to be reached and so forth. They were too stubborn. So he came home with his tail between his legs. He failed. He told his abbot back in Iona what had happened, and Aidan was there, and he said, listen, you didn't do it right. He said, you didn't do it right. You didn't treat the people right. You got to be humble. You got to serve them. You got to reach them. And as he talked, the abbot saw his way of speaking, and he said, you know what? I think you might be the guy for the job. And so you got to watch out saying, criticizing people, telling them they're doing it wrong because you might be picked to do it. And let's see what you can do. Well, Aidan was sent back to Oswald and to Northumbria, England, northern England. And he ended up starting a famous monastery there called Lindisfarne off the coast of England. He patterned himself after Iona because that's where he was trained. And so Oswald was thrilled with him, and he actually would go around with Aidan as he would evangelize. And he would even translate for him from time to time because Aidan spoke Irish. At first he didn't speak English, and so his messages had to be translated. But this man was supposedly traveled all around on foot. He wouldn't even ride a horse. If he came up alongside someone walking along, he'd just start sharing with them and evangelizing them. And he was a man who really loved his people and reached them for Christ. He won many, many people to Christ. He was quite a missionary. And he represented the Celtic branch of the church, which is the Irish branch. And if you know anything about history, the Irish branch and the Latin branch, the Roman branch, which Augustine of Canterbury had established earlier, they didn't see eye to eye on a lot of different things, and they clashed, and they never did work well together. And by the way, I just said that Augustine of Canterbury established the gospel in England. Well, he did, and he had pushed up into the north. And then why did Aidan have to come later and reestablish Christianity? Well, because in the turmoil and the wars up there in the north of England, the Christians were actually pushed out, and there was a resurgence of paganism. And so that's why when Aidan came, it was in a real dark state, and he had to start over evangelizing the place. There, turn off my phone. Okay, so I love to read about that guy. Terrific missionary. The next one I want to mention is Boniface. He's also known as Winfrid of Nursling. I'm glad no one ever named me Winfrid. But Boniface is known as the most successful Anglo-Saxon missionary. So we had Rome sending Augustine to reach the English. So we had Irish reaching English. We had Irish reaching the Scots, and so forth. Now we have an Anglo-Saxon missionary. And so he leaves from that area and comes over to Frisia first, which is Belgium. Again, they'd already had the gospel, but then the church ebbs and flows. It makes progress and then falls back. So he worked in Frisia for a time, and then he worked into Germany, east of the Rhine, north of the Danube. And he is credited with pushing the frontiers of Christianity northward towards Scandinavia. He was in the period of the 720s through the early 750s AD. There's a famous story about him. Don't know if it's completely legendary or what, but apparently when he came to this one area of Germany, they had this great oak tree near their village, and they thought that was the tree of Jupiter. Some people say, or of Thor. I'm not sure. Different stories said it different ways. But apparently this giant oak sort of was seen as representative of their god in some way. And so one former missionary had told Boniface, he said, go easy on the people. Just don't be too direct with them because you'll offend them and turn them off, and, they're violent. And but he didn't listen all the time. He didn't listen to that kind of wisdom. And in this particular case, he's rumored to have, supposedly he took an axe and went straight to where that tree was. And the people heard what he was doing, and they came out, all these people from their villages, and they were cursing him under their breath, and they were like, what do you think you're going to do here with the tree of our God? And according to the story, Boniface just boldly began chopping. And we have some big oaks here in Florida, and I've had to chop down some trees, littler trees, and saw down things and so forth. I'll tell you what, I don't know how they did it back then with an axe, chopping down a huge oak. But supposedly when he struck the first blow, a mighty wind came, and the tree just broke and shattered and came down and fell into 4 pieces. Again, might be legendary, but that was the kind of story that circulated about this man. And so the thing about him was that he was powerful and forceful and very aggressive with the gospel, and he just went around, planting the church everywhere. And the kings known as the Carolingian kings, that's for Charlemagne, the great king. All his line, they're called the Carolingian kings. And so they ended up supporting Boniface because Charlemagne was not really that Christian, but he wanted to be for Christianity. And so Christianity was sort of identified with Charlemagne's people, the Franks. And so that line of kings supported Boniface because in their mind, if he took Christianity around to all these neighboring areas, that would bring those people in line with the Frankish Empire. So you see there was like this mixture of political and spiritual goals there and motives. And that happens a lot in church history. It was actually helpful to Boniface at first, of course, because he had the approval of these kings and their support and so forth. But on the other hand, there were negatives to it because some of the areas he tried to bring the gospel to did not want to fall under the authority of the Frankish kings. And so they saw this religion as a means by which the Franks would get control over them. And that still goes on today. When I was in Mexico preaching, people said, your government sent you down here to divide us because we're all Catholic and you're trying to bring another teaching here so that the Americans can control us. The stuff still goes on today. But anyway, Boniface, he was a mighty man of God, and he established some 60 monasteries, including one of the most important ones in a place called Mainz, Germany, which became the center of German Christianity. He also anointed a man named Pepin the Short. I'm glad that's not my name, Pepin, the Short. I don't want to be called the Short. Pepin the Short might sound like a funny name, but he's actually the father of Charlemagne, and so he initiated this thing of the Carolingian kings. He inaugurated him, and Charlemagne, of course, was later coronated by the Pope. And so Boniface had a powerful impact politically in that region. Now, the next monks I want to mention are two. They're brothers. And their work was in the 9th century, the 800s. These two brothers are Cyril and his brother Methodius. It depends on where you are, how you pronounce it, but most people today in America say Cyril. But I learned Russian. I studied Russian for a long time. I've been in a lot of Russian-speaking countries, and he's called Kirill there. And so and the alphabet of Russia is called the Cyrillic or Kyrillic alphabet. Why? Because St. Cyril went to areas where Slavic people lived with his brother Methodius, and actually learned their language and created for them an alphabet, just like Wycliffe translators do today for many different peoples in the world. These guys were born in Thessalonica, Greece, and they were Byzantine theologians. Now, historians say we're not sure if they were purely Greek or if they had Slavic blood as well. That's not sure. However, the Byzantine Emperor Michael and the Patriarch of Constantinople, Photius, during this time, they sent Cyril to work among a group called the Khazars in what is today southern Russia. They sent him out on a mission there. Apparently, leaders of the Khazars, that's Khazars, they had contacted Constantinople because they wanted Christian teachers to be sent who could teach them Christian teachings, but also who could speak with Jews and Saracens, which is their term for Muslim people. Remember, the Turks at this time were a constant threat. The Islamic world was a constant threat with Europe. They bordered there, and so the leaders of the Khazars wanted somebody who knew about Judaism, about Islam, and also about Christianity. And so Cyril went there, and it's possible his brother went as well. He later returned to either Thessalonica or Constantinople. I think he was in Constantinople for a while. But then later, the king of a place called Moravia. Now, Moravia is hard to describe, but it's today the Czech Republic, it's Slovakia, parts of Poland, Hungary, and Serbia. All of that was included in Moravia. And so the king of this land at that time was named Ratislav. And he sent to Constantinople and said, look, I want you to send missionaries. It's believed that his motives were probably not all spiritual, but were political. Roman Catholic missionaries were already in his lands. He didn't want to associate with them because they came from the Frankish Empire, and he didn't want the Franks getting control. So he wanted help from Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor, and the Byzantine Empire. So he sent to them to have missionaries sent. And so St. Cyril and his brother Methodius went up into that region, which is today Czech Republic and all that. And They worked to promote the things of God, the kingdom of God. They went there around 862 AD, and they worked among these Slavic people. As I say, they eventually developed an alphabet for the people, which is called Glagolitic, but it is a predecessor of a language called Old Slavonic, which all the Slavic people ended up using in their Orthodox churches. Old Slavonic. I've seen it when I was in Russia. I've heard it and I've seen it written and so forth. And that's also a predecessor of Russian. And that's why all the alphabets of that part of the world are Cyrillic or Kyrillic. And you'll see, the Bulgarians I was in Croatia. They have Cyrillic. Serbs have it. Many different peoples there, Slavic peoples. And I was in Ukraine. I saw a statue of Saint Cyril, and so they were responsible for really fostering the growth of the church and of the gospel amongst the Slavs, and also of developing their written language, because they had a spoken language, but they didn't have a written language. And so it's because of St. Cyril and Methodius that the Slavic people are Orthodox to this day, and it's one of the largest parts of the Orthodox Church of the world, the Slavic component of that, and it's all due to their work. So, I'm wrapping up now, but let me just mention that that was in the 800s. There were then very significant developments in monasticism in the 11th through the 13th centuries. And I can't go into it in much detail, but it's very, very significant. I would really urge you to study some about it. Look into the revival of Christianity that took place in the Middle Ages and in that period from the 11th to the 13th century, because it really was a revival. I mean, many monastic orders were established, groups of nuns, groups of monks, monasteries, very significant church leaders, very significant theologians and so forth were developed during this time. The orders that were established, such as the Carthusians, the Cistercians, the Knights Templar, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, everybody's heard of them. All those orders came into being during this period. It was a great revival, and it makes me think of Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith, where the writer of Hebrews says, "Time would fail me to speak of all these," and he starts listing all these great heroes of the faith. That's how I feel about this period. This is like many lectures we could spend talking about it, but please do some study about it. Let me mention a few. Bernard of Clairvaux. I love the guy. I read his thing on the love of God. It was powerful. It really impacted me. Bernard. And then there's Saint Dominic, the Dominican, the originator of the Dominican order. Francis of Assisi, nearly everybody's heard of him. What a great saint. He took a vow of poverty, walked around barefoot preaching. He sent them out preachers. Of course, the Dominicans were also known as the preachers. They were known as friars. There were black friars and gray friars, and they really lived a life of devotion, poverty, and like really preaching and so forth. They studied the scriptures intently. They became theologians. There was a monastery at a place called St. Victor near Paris. Some famous monks there, Hugh of St. Victor, Richard of St. Victor, great theologians that came up with profound insights and teachings and so forth that we can read. Then amongst the Dominicans, there was Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas. These are some of the greatest theologians that have ever been. There were tremendous monasteries, like I say, St. Victor, Clairvaux, Cluny, and then various others that just had a powerful impact. As I said, I've read some of Bernard's writings. I've read Hugh and Richard of St. Victor. I've studied a little of Thomas Aquinas. I've been impressed. I want to study more. He's just very heavy and very profound. I want to explore his work. Let me just mention one guy that most people haven't heard of, and that's why I want to mention him. His name was Ramon Lull, and he was a Catalan, which Catalonia is part of Spain, but you may not realize in the 1200s, Catalan became an empire of its own, and it was Spain, and it was the Balearic Islands, I think they're called, off the coast of Spain, and then even down to North Africa. They traded with the Muslims and so forth. Catalan was a language spoken all over. And this guy, Ramon Lull, he became a Christian and actually bought an Arab slave. This was the time when the Spaniards, the Catalonians and all were pushing the Muslims off the Iberian Peninsula and the islands and so forth. But he bought a Muslim slave and got the man to teach him Arabic. And then one day the slave said to him, "Why are you learning my language anyway?" And he said, "Because I want to win Muslims like you to Christ." Well, the guy just looked and grabbed a knife and jumped up and stabbed Ramon Lul and then ran off. Lul was just bleeding there. And so Lul got help. He recovered from the wound. But what happened is the Arab slave knew that he would probably be hunted down and executed, so he hanged himself. And the guilt so impacted Ramon Lul because he didn't want the guy to die like that. Oh, I forgot to say, Ramon Lul, the guy said, "I don't want you to learn Arabic to win my people to Christ. We're better. Islam is better than your religion." And Ramon Lul lost his temper and slapped him. That's when the guy grabbed a knife and stabbed him and ran off. So Lul felt terribly guilty. Well, he devoted his life to developing apologetic methods of reaching Muslims. And also he appealed to the Pope and to different leaders and established Arabic schools for training missionaries. He was one of the first guys, him and St. Francis, were some of the only guys in that period who said, look, instead of launching crusades to kill Muslims, let's win them to Christ. What a concept, right? And so he's an amazing man. I love reading his stuff. He wrote love poetry as well and lots of other things. He was a brilliant man. By the way, I love him because he's so human. He pledged himself to go as a missionary to the Muslims, and he actually, his friends saw him off down at the wharf, and he was going to get on the ship and sail. He had his stuff loaded on the ship already, and then he chickened out, and he came ashore and he hid, and he couldn't go. He was too afraid, and so he was so ashamed. He ended up going later. He did end up going, and he did win very few converts, but a few converts in North Africa, and then he returned to Europe. And in later life, when he was an old man, he actually returned and he said, "I've had enough of this patience stuff." And he went out on the street and he preached that Islam was a false religion, Muhammad was a false prophet, and he was beaten by an angry mob, and he was put on a ship and he died a few days later on his way home. So I love him because he chickened out, but yet he repented of being a coward, and he went back, and I've written 2 different papers on him, so if you ever want to see those, let me know. So now I'll just wrap up by just saying this. Again, there are aspects of monasticism that are not the best. The sort of legalistic tendencies, the isolationist tendencies, the extreme asceticism, all right? We talked about that. And there were advances and there were retreats in monasticism. In other words, there were bright spots and there were dark spots. There were sins that were committed. There were sex in the monasteries and abortion of babies and things like that. There were horrors. But I got to tell you, this was a move of God. And there were many, many powerful things, very positive things that were spread abroad through monastic influence. I think that one of the greatest things is just their emphasis on the spiritual disciplines. I've done some study on that, some papers on that and so forth. That's just completely ignored for the most part in the American church today. And the trouble is, people say, "Oh, that's legalism." But no, it's not. It's the only way you really experience God, through spiritual disciplines. I'll talk about that more someday. But these folks teach us that. The monastic movements teach us that. Yes, you can go off and get too extreme, or you can get proud, or you can be like Martin Luther. We'll see when we talk about the Reformation. Martin Luther was so desperate to please God, and his monasticism, really, well, it led him to Christ, but I can't say that because of that it was good, because it was not monasticism's fault, it was Luther, but Luther's concept was, God doesn't accept me, I got to do more, I've got to fast more, I've got to sleep on the floor, I've got to crawl around on my knees, I've got to do this, and he got so into that, and he was never, ever satisfied. He never felt that God accepted him. So he admitted that he actually came to hate God because he said, "You're just so demanding and nobody can ever meet your requirements." And so he hated God. Well, see, that kind of a thing, that can sometimes be the fruit of this concept of asceticism and spiritual discipline. It has to be held in balance. But when you understand that, the monastic emphasis on spiritual disciplines is something we sorely need today. It's something that would bring balance. It's something that would help people to experience God. And so many of these people were of God, and their lives inspire us. I mean, their devotion to God, their love for God, their disciplined lives. the way they preserved scripture and culture, the way they conducted themselves, carrying on evangelism and missions, man, it's a real model for us. I mean, they worked as a team. They go into an area, like 12 of them, like Iden or like Columba, and they plant a monastery, and they live there and worship and pray, and they do their own work, and they gradually reach the people. Tremendous models for us of missions and evangelism. Also, their focus on study and learning, I love that. That's where schools develop. That's where the universities develop. It was tremendous. They studied the scripture. People today are too lazy. We don't study much. People don't want to know what the Bible even says. Monasticism also provided an avenue for greater devotion to God for many, many thousands of people. People wanted more of God. You couldn't get enough just going to Mass on Sunday. And so monasticism was a way for people who really wanted to know God and really wanted to pursue God and serve God. It was a way for them to express that and to live that out. That women were allowed too. That was another thing, that it was equality. Like women could be nuns, and there were many groups of nuns, and also women who didn't have to go all the way to being nuns, but they would be like nuns, the Beguines, or I can't remember how you pronounce it, but Beguine. That was a movement of women. And so it was tremendous that it provided those equal rights, and it provided a way of pursuing more of a spiritual life. The monastics also demonstrate a real concern for the poor and for practical service in the community. I mean, they helped the sick, they helped the poor, they did real and practical things. They also did all these things I talked about, like improvements in agriculture, many different things like that. Developing windmills and machines to make work easier, and many, many things like that. Education, healthcare, as I mentioned, the first hospitals were started by monks. So, really caring for the poor, this was a monastic development. The importance of prayer and meditation, the importance of renouncing the world, we learn all this, we see all this modeled in the monastics. And again, so many of the greatest Christians of history, the ones who established our doctrines, the ones who evangelized the Western and the Eastern world, they were monks, they were nuns. Pachomius, Anthony, Origen, Athanasius, Benedict, Basil, Gregory, Patrick, Ambrose, John Chrysostom, Augustine, Jerome, Ramon Llull, Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, Macrina, the sister of Basil of Caesarea, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, Mother Teresa, so many others. So, I mean, you just cannot dismiss that. This is something to learn from, something to admire, something to study. And I will end with this, okay? I can show you very definitely through many books, through many different scholars, not just one or two. There are many, many sources that will back up what I'm about to say here. I can show you that it was really through the monastic movement that, first of all, the Christian gospel was promulgated, and the church was spread, and the world was evangelized. But it was monastics and monastic movements that were directly responsible. Listen to this list. And you might not even like some of these things, but it's just true. I can show you. They're responsible for the rise of capitalism. Yes, capitalism. A cash economy. Liberal democracies like we enjoy today. Democratic forms of government. Public education from K to university. All of that. Broad intellectual and theological development. Even the rise of modern science, folks. It really happened through monks. Francis Bacon was one of the earliest scientists. Science arose in Western Europe and nowhere else. I can prove that to you too. That's controversial. Some people get all really mad when I say that. Look, there's a lot of literature on it. I can prove this. I'm talking about the scientific method that we know today that has so advanced our lives, right? It's so caused us to flourish and live longer and so forth. So many things that we have received through the development of modern science and technology. It arose in the monastic movements, in monasteries. And last of all, monasticism eventually grew and developed into something called scholasticism, which in many ways set the stage for the Reformation. Many monks were responsible for the Reformation, and I want to look at both of those in the next talk. I hope you'll join me then, and until then, may the Lord richly bless you.